It has been such a pleasure to be with you this weekend to do the storytelling workshop on Thursday night with folks who were able to be there, and then to hear this amazing crop of stories that happened last night downstairs. It's an amazing way to get to know a congregation, to get to know a group of people. So I'm grateful for the hospitality and have been so glad to be here all weekend. Our first reading is a poem. It's a poem called Welcoming Angels. The poet's name is Pat Schneider. And it's one of the non-scriptural foundational texts of this new church that I'm planting, of Gilead. And we're trying to be church with people who have been told or made to feel that church is not for them, people who have been turned out or turned off or just left cold. And so I think you'll hear in this poem why this may be a foundational text for a church that seeks to welcome folks back. So our first reading from Pat Schneider. Between the last war and the next one, waiting for the northbound train that travels by the river, I sit alone in the middle of the night and welcome angels. Welcome back, old hymns, old songs, all the music, the rhyme and rhythm. Welcome angels and archangels. Welcome early guesses at the names of things. Welcome wings. I have grown tired of disbelief. What once was brave is boring. Welcome back to my embrace, stranger, visitor beside the Jabbok. Welcome wrestling until dawn, until it's my hip thrown out of joint, my pillow stone, my ladder of antique assumptions. Welcome what is not my own. Glory on the top rung, coming down. And I'll save our second reading for a little bit. I was riding the northbound Clark bus, the number 22 bus in Chicago. I was sitting on the aisle. In the window seat next to me was a man I had met that summer, and I was so glad. We weren't talking much, but it was August and dark out, and we were on our way home. The bus was full of, like, everyone who rides the Clark bus. And the next stop, I saw Meredith get on. She got on the bus, and she was red-faced, like maybe she'd been crying. But she was in running clothes, so maybe she was red-faced like she'd been running. She walked down the aisle, and when she got close to me, we made eye contact, and it wasn't from running. She was distraught. She was definitely crying. From my aisle seat, I looked up. Hey, she said hi, and her eyes flicked back down. Meredith. Oh my gosh, she said, I didn't recognize you. I turned to the man and said, hey, can she sit here? He got up, and Meredith took his seat. Leaning towards each other, our heads close together, I asked, what happened? Our scripture today comes from the Hebrew Bible, from Genesis, and we are dropping into a scene. It's a scene that might be familiar to many of you, but we are in the middle of things, and it's a scene like something out of a Western or a Cormac McCarthy novel. It's a man fleeing for his life as the sun sets. And the man looking over his shoulder is Jacob. He's headed away from home and into the unknown. He's thrown his things together and left because of the whispered warning of his mother, your brother is going to kill you. So the sun is setting, and Jacob can hear the blood pounding in his ears. He's in between Beersheba and Haran, which is to say he's nowhere. But now, finally, it's dark. Our reading. Jacob came to a certain place and stayed there for the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head and lay down in that place. And he dreamed that there was a ladder set up on the earth, the top of it reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And God stood beside him and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. I'm skipping a few verses if you're reading along. Know that I am with you, God said, and I will keep you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave until I have done what I promised you. Jacob woke up from his sleep and said, surely God is in this place, and I didn't know it. And he was afraid, and he said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God, And this is the gate of heaven. God interrupts Jacob's anxious journey. Jacob, who is nowhere, Jacob, who is very much focused on the project of saving his life and maybe regretting what he did that got him to that moment, maybe regretting it. As you may know, Jacob is kind of a piece of work. The last thing on his mind is an encounter with the divine, the God of his father, the God of his grandparents. They've got their stories about how great God is, about God's promises to them, about this unique relationship that they've got with God. But so far for Jacob, they're just stories. God's never told him anything. God's just kind of in the background for Jacob. No one-on-one meetings with God like for his grandfather Abraham. No miraculous births like for his grandma Sarah. No crazy stuff, thank goodness, like his dad, Isaac, almost being sacrificed because God asked for it, briefly. Life for Jacob has been basic. It's been cooking with his mother, hanging around the tents, and playing high-stakes pranks on his twin brother. But here, now, God shows up in a moment when Jacob is profoundly vulnerable. He's on his own, fleeing for his life after dark in a strange place that is not a place. God shows up and announces that God is not just the God of his father and grandfather, his mother and grandmother, but that God is also the God of Jacob. God doesn't belong just to those forebears. God is present right there where Jacob is now in this no-place place, a place that he's just stumbled onto, like the way you might stumble onto a bus if you were just trying to get home. The number 22 Clark bus, as you may surmise, is not a destination. It's not a place. It's liminal. It's neither here nor there. I mean, it's a bus. Yes, all buses are in between. But it's also a particular kind of bus, the people who ride the Clark bus. Best case scenario, weird, quiet, and everyone on their phones. The alternative, there's like a weird guy who gets on at Lawrence Ave with a bunch of bags and a wet cough. Worse, the game lets out and the bus is packed with drunk Cubs fans. The quiet's okay. Meredith and I had met the summer before at a party where we'd hit it off, but our friendship was kind of a slow burn. We'd hung out a couple of times, we'd made plans to make plans, but when she got on the bus that night, although we already felt a deep kinship, we didn't actually know each other that well. And now I had my arm over the back of her seat, leaning in toward her, my head tipped down, listening, mostly not making eye contact with her. "I can't imagine literally anyone better to run into," she said. What happened? The answer, not a simple one, is that nothing very specific had happened and that everything had. She wasn't fleeing for her life, but she was fleeing in a way. Earlier that day, an old trauma reawakened, reopened, painful and raw. And still tender, she had gone out to meet friends, hoping to shake it off. Her boyfriend was there, and he'd said, "Just come out with us, you'll feel better." But she didn't. Especially when the friends, with the kind of casual sexism that bubbles up all over, it turns out, when the casual sexism bubbled up in the middle of the conversation and no one blinked. When the rape jokes started in this group of friends and then kept going, no one noticed that she blanched. Her boyfriend, who knew what trauma she was carrying with her that night, knew what had happened earlier. If he noticed, he didn't say anything. She didn't feel better. She felt betrayed. She felt the culture of hate pressing in threateningly and no one noticing. She felt isolated. She fled for the 22 bus. No, she fled for home. The 22 bus was the way there. And now the sun had set. And instead of being alone in between, we were together. And I felt enormous gratitude to be there at that moment, in that vulnerability, in that no-place place. Part of why I tell stories at church, and part of why I think you should, why I'm planting a new church with storytelling at its core, is that I believe that in that moment, God was in that place. In any encounter where we show up for another person, listen to her story, share our own, God is in that place. And for so many people, it comes as life-saving news that God doesn't belong just to their parents or grandparents, or to those people over there who claim that God belongs to them. I mean, you may know that already. I hope you do. But there are lots of people who don't. People who think that God belongs to someone else, that God belongs to someone else's theology or politics. We here might forget how radical it is to sing, God is here. God is with us, with you, for you. We might forget how life-changing it is to be told, you are loved. God is with you. Frankly, I hope that you do know so deeply the love of God that you are able regularly to take it for granted. But if and when we as a church, and I don't mean this congregation, if and when we as a church know that we are loved, the time has more than come to tell other people. To tell other people that God shows up all the time. God shows up just to announce that God is our God too. Not just in those other people's stories, not back then and over there, but right here, in your story, and mine, and hers. The people I am church with at Gilead are people who have been told or made to feel that Jesus is not theirs. They cannot sing with confidence, blessed assurance, Jesus is mine. They have been told that God is not for them. They have been told that the table, which you know is a feast prepared by God's own hand for all peoples, they have been told that the table is not for them. Many of them have been told that because they are gay. Many of them feel it for other reasons. They have been turned out by families, by churches, by pastors. I'm claiming in this sermon, for sure, and by my own insistence on storytelling as a spiritual practice, that God shows up when and where least expected. And who expects God to show up? I mean, nobody's smart or modern or sophisticated, right? Nobody who's been hurt by church people. I'm claiming that God shows up where least expected, on the bus and on the way out of Beersheba. With our storytelling last night, we, or at least I, am claiming that God shows up in encounters with other people. And you know that. You know that part of church is just showing up, remembering a few names, smiling at people, that counts. But then to hear the stories that other people tell, and maybe to tell the ones that we have, maybe even the ones we're afraid or embarrassed to tell. And I know that not everyone is ready or wants to tell that kind of story, or maybe doesn't want to tell the story at all. But part of what I'm claiming is that however you tell it, to whomever you tell it, your story is a place where God shows up. Jacob thought that his campsite was just a place. He didn't even think it was a place. He thought his pillow rock was just a rock. And we think, that's just my life. But part of what I'm claiming, part of what I think Jacob's story claims is that your story is more than that. I'm daring to call the flare-ups of connection and love and forgiveness, I'm daring to call that God. And because, well, there's a way where some of this stuff is internal to us. We carry it around with us, our capacity to love. There's another way that this all points to a glory that is well beyond us, a glory that we cannot contain. And when that glory shows up, it may be revealed to us that the number 22 bus is none other than the house of God, the gate of heaven. And we dare to say right there on the bus, welcome angels and archangels. Welcome what is not my own, glory on the top rung, coming down. Amen.